Well, let's bring into the conversation Mick Mulvaney, the former Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump. Mick, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Always a pleasure having you on Arabiya English. I'd like to start by asking you, are you surprised that Steve Witkoff and the rest of the delegation is essentially returning to Washington empty-handed?
Not really. I mean, the pattern has sort of been to return with something that have that something turn out to nothing. So I guess returning empty-handed, if you want to use that term, really isn't that big of a surprise. They need to change the dynamic. They really do. They need to change sort of the status quo right now. I think what the American team is realizing that the Russians are not interested in ending the war anytime soon, and they still think they're going to get a better deal on the battlefield than they are at the table. And until that calculation changes, I don't see much possibility for success. Clearly, it's not impossible, but it's very difficult to cut a deal with somebody when they don't want to cut a deal.
I mean, what you're saying sounds very much like what a lot of European heads of state and leaders are saying. And they've been sort of shut out of the conversation, or at least they say they feel blindsided and somewhat excluded. I mean, why doesn't President Trump want to hear that line of argument?
Oh, I think it's okay to hear the line of argument. The question is, if you want to have Europe sit at the table with you and have a conversation, who is that? I mean, which of the 27 people speak for Europe? I mean, if it's Ursula, then that's fine, I guess, but I get the impression that it's not. And then within the 27, you've got, the UK who have done a great deal of work, the Germans who have started to sort of kick in, the French who have been sort of late to the game in terms of actually providing support, and then the Spanish and the Italians who've done nothing. So does somebody who doesn't participate in the fighting of the war get to contribute to the discussions about ending the war? I think that's a fair conversation to have. What you're seeing here, though, Tom, is the general sort of antipathy that Trump and his administration have to dealing with multilateral organizations. They don't like them, they don't trust them, they don't really they can't get their heads around them, and they'd much rather deal bilaterally with people.
The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio is a notable absentee at the gathering of NATO foreign ministers in Brussels today. What do you read into that?
I wouldn't read too much into it. I know it's going to get a lot of attention because I know that's how people sort of look at the world, but Marco would be in regular communication with those folks anyway. Today is not a really good day for him to be away from the office. If you, judging by the cabinet meeting, the 2.5-hour cabinet meeting that Trump had yesterday, which was televised to just about everywhere, that something in Venezuela could be imminent. And it's probably more important for the Secretary of State, who's also doing double duty as the National Security Advisor, to sort of stick close to home when times are tense like that.
Mick, I'm going to be asking you a bit about Venezuela, if you don't mind, in a couple of minutes, so we'll come back to that. But just staying with these efforts to bring about an end to the war in Ukraine, something that Marco Rubio said, the US Secretary of State said, he said it would be irrational not to be engaging with Moscow. I mean, do you think the Americans should be talking to the Russians at this stage, or perhaps do you think it's premature in the absence of any indication from the Russians that they actually want peace?
You know, I know there's several schools of thought on this. I've always been in the same camp as Marco. Of course, Marco was in the Senate when I was in the House. I've known him now for about 15 years, which is nothing usually bad comes from talking to people. I remember going back to the debates between Barack Obama and John McCain about who would talk to who. And it seems like everybody at some point or the other wants to talk to somebody else unless your political opponent is talking to them, in which case you criticize them for talking to them. So, look, I think that's been overly politicized. I see no harm in having the lines of communication open. Whether or not those lines of communication are back channels at mid-levels or at the very highest levels, I don't think really makes a difference. It doesn't change, though, Tom, what we talked about at the outset, which is talk all you want, but until you convince the Russians that they want a deal, you're not going to get one. So I'm not sure how much talking changes that, unless there's subject matters in those discussions that I'm not fully aware of.
I mean, Steve Witkoff's been to Moscow 7 times now, by my count. I mean, maybe maybe you have another number for me. But I mean, do you get the impression he's the right person to be negotiating in this way on this sort of issue with the Russians? I mean, he hasn't delivered results. Do you think President Trump might have a change of heart with
I
regard to
suppose
his
it's possible.
position?
We hear the rumor that Jared Kushner may get involved. I think Steve has done a pretty good job in other parts of the world. And importantly, and I can't stress this enough, Tom, when it comes to the operation of the White House. I mean, I don't know much about international geopolitics. I know a little bit about running the White House. And having somebody who is involved in those negotiations, who has the full trust of the President of the United States, a full line of communication with the President of the United States, and a read on the President's state of mind, that's probably some of the more important things you can have in a negotiator. I used to tell people when I was a special envoy to Northern Ireland, look, I might not know that much about Northern Ireland. I know a little bit about it, but I do know if I pick up the phone and make a call, the President's going to take it. And that's probably the most important sort of thing that someone can bring to the negotiations, especially when so many decisions, as with the Trump administration, get made at the very top ultimately.
Right, but there are a lot of people on this particular dossier in the Trump administration. I mean, we've talked about Marco Rubio, we've talked about Steve Witkoff, there's Jared Kushner, there's different schools of thought, perhaps from Vice President J.D. Vance. I mean, there are rumors of differences of opinion on what the right approach is. I mean, do you buy into that? Do you think there are perhaps some splits in the inner circle of President Trump?
Not only do I believe it, I would fully expect it. What you've just described is how Donald Trump operates. What you've just said could apply to his negotiations on tax policy domestically. They can apply to trade policy overseas. Trump likes to have more than one senior advisor, sort of more than one senior person involved in negotiations at this level. So that doesn't surprise me. And he's always encouraged sort of debate within his team. He likes people to disagree. Oftentimes, Tom will see himself as sort of a moderator, a mediator, a judge, so that it's okay and, in fact, encouraged to have people who might have differing opinions on how to handle Ukraine, how to handle trade, et cetera. So, no, that doesn't surprise me. In fact, what would surprise me if it was simply one person speaking with one voice for the President of the United States, because that's not how the president works. The only one person that really speaks for Donald Trump is Donald Trump.
So you don't think there's one person who stands out amongst all of these different people as being the person that perhaps President Trump trusts the most when it comes to foreign policy issues?
No, I think it could change day to day. I think it could change topic to topic. For example, I think Marco Rubio is probably the leading voice when it comes to Venezuela right now, but I'd be surprised, I'd be stunned if he was the only voice. Same would be the case with Witkoff overseas, probably the leading voice, but Trump is going to listen to a bunch of different people. I don't necessarily see that as a weakness. In fact, there'd be several folks, I think, who could make the case it's a strength. So no, it doesn't surprise me that it's running like this. If you want to be critical of it, be critical of the results, not the process. Be critical of the fact that Trump thought he's had a deal now 4 or 5 different times. The meeting in Alaska directly with Putin comes to mind, and that's not happened. And that sooner or later, someone's going to have to realize that maybe the Russians aren't that interested in ending this war. And until you change that calculation, the war is not going to end.
Okay, so if that calculation changes, do you see President Trump saying, right, okay, the negotiating table doesn't work, back to the battlefield, let's give Ukraine better weaponry, more weaponry, and give them a better chance of winning this war?
It's certainly one of the options that are available. There's no question. If you ask Trump, he would never take that option off of the table. If he did, it would completely hamstring him in the negotiations. So that has to be on the table. All of the options have to be on the table, up to including completely walking away. That's what you say if you need to try to motivate the Ukrainians to move towards a deal, or escalating the conflict, which is what you might say to negotiate, to encourage the Russians. On that spectrum of possibilities, there's probably limitless options. And Trump is not known for taking them off the table, and I don't expect him to take any options off the table here.
Let's talk about Venezuela. It's already come up in conversation a couple of times, and I did say we'd get around to it. I mean, looking at all the facts before us, looks like there's something of an escalation happening in the Caribbean. What do you think is President Trump's desired outcome with regards to Venezuela?
Yeah, I don't know. This one confuses me a little bit more than Ukraine. I think I understand Ukraine. Again, it doesn't mean that I know how to fix it, but I think I understand the lay of the land and why we're doing what we're doing. Venezuela's a little bit more confusing to me. We had these exact discussion, Tom, in the first Trump administration about what we were going to do, if anything, about Maduro and so forth. And Trump regularly pushed back against any sort of suggestion of military action in the region. Clearly, that has changed, or at least is apparently changed. As one naval expert put it to me the other day, you don't move the George Bush aircraft carrier into a region and not use it. So I think many of us here expect some type of kinetic action in the near future, which is really surprising to me. I still don't foresee a circumstance where Donald Trump would commit land troops, American soldiers on the ground in Venezuela. But it's looking more and more like he is willing to do, some what we call Tomahawk diplomacy, sort of a standoff attack from a distance and so forth. That is surprising to me because it is a sea change from where we were in the first term. My guess is it's the influence of Marco Rubio, influence of some of the other Latin nations, and the reinvigoration of the Monroe Doctrine that we are going to pay much closer attention to everything in the Western Hemisphere.
And how's this going to go down with President Trump's support base? Because President Trump came to power very much on a ticket that he wasn't going to be starting more wars. He was going to be ending wars. I mean, there's already some disquiet about certain foreign policy issues in the ranks of Team MAGA. I mean, doesn't this go against what he campaigned for?
It depends. Keep in mind, let's draw some parallels. They're not perfect parallels and analogies, and I get that, but there are some between the action against Iran. It was a one-off. It was a massive blow with tremendous apparent results, okay? And that helped Trump politically. That was well received politically. I think if there's some sort of similar action in Venezuela that is very, very limited, especially in duration, it won't hurt President Trump hardly at all. In fact, I can make the argument if it goes well, it could help him politically. Americans don't care that much about foreign policy, but when we like it when we have successes overseas. The other end of the spectrum there is, though, if for whatever reason we end up getting bogged down in some type of military action in Venezuela, that would be received extraordinarily poorly. It's hard to exaggerate how poorly that would be received. I think right now the polling data would suggest that only like 20% of Americans would actually support a sustained military action in Venezuela, if that high. Donald Trump is not usually on the wrong side of 80-20 political issues. So I don't see him getting involved in something long-term. But if that is what happens, that will reflect very badly upon him personally, and also weigh many of the Republicans down as they go into the midterm elections later in 2026, because they either have to choose to be going with a very unpopular president on that issue or against a very popular president on other issues. And that's not a fun place to be when you're running for re-election.
So your prediction would be, you don't think he's going to go for a sustained military campaign in Venezuela. Do you think a surgical, quick, clean strike would be a more likely line of action?
Much more likely. I think the chances of doing nothing are probably about 10%. I think the chances of doing something long-term with soldiers engaged on the ground is probably less than 5%, and the other 85% then would be a limited sort of surgical type of effort.
Okay, and I mean, what is it that President Trump is so upset about with regards to Venezuela? Is it the narcotics, or is it the immigration dimension? What do you think it is that's really made President Trump so incandescent with regards to President Maduro?
It's probably a little bit of both. The drugs is serious. It is. I mean, they inflate the numbers, of course, in terms of the number of deaths that they've prevented with their military action up to now. They try to claim that, they've killed enough drug runners to save X number of American lives, but not nearly that many people died from fentanyl drugs overdoses in the United States in the last couple of years. So there's a little bit of hyperbole in there, but don't let that distract you from the fact that Trump really does care about the drug flow and really does care about immigration. I don't think that's the only difference, though, here, Tom, because that existed in 2019 when I was the chief of staff. Both of those conditions did. The Venezuelans were running drugs, and they were encouraging the illegal immigration on our southern border. That hasn't changed. What's changed is Marco Rubio, an aggressive anti-communist, as you would expect a Cuban American to be, taking the role of the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. Again, I'll come back to the same thing we started off with, which is what surprises me is that John Bolton was just as eager to do something kinetic in Venezuela as it appears that Marco Rubio is. So again, I'm not sure what's changed, but clearly we're looking at a possibly different course of action than we took 5 years ago.
I mean, if you asked Nicolas Maduro what the main interest was that President Trump had in his country, he would probably point to the estimated 300 billion barrels of oil that Venezuela sits on, a fifth of the world's oil reserves. I mean, is oil a factor here?
I would think so. I mean, Trump has several times, suggested that foreign policy under the Obama administration should have focused on, taking more oil out of the Middle East. So is that maybe floating through Trump's head? Probably. Now, I don't know what form that would take. Again, I can't imagine it would be an invasion with an American takeover of the oil fields. But there may be some calculation here that the dealing with the next Venezuelan government might be more beneficial to America when it comes to getting Venezuelan oil. Certainly, that would be part of the calculation. But I don't see it as sort of a precursor towards an invasion.
Just lastly, I want to circle back to Ukraine very briefly, because we've got a bit more information than we did at the start of the conversation about what's being discussed in Brussels at that NATO gathering. We've heard Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, saying in the last hour or so, NATO is a defensive alliance. We will remain a defensive alliance, but make no mistake, we're ready and willing to do what it takes to protect our 1 billion people and secure our territory. I mean, this comes the day after President Putin said the Europeans wanted war and that Russia was ready for war. I mean, what do you make of this? Are we looking at a serious escalation here?
I don't know if you're looking at a serious escalation, but certainly the rhetoric is a lot hotter than it has been recently. I think and I have this conversation with a lot of my American friends, it is important to note that Ukraine is not a NATO country. I get it's important. I'm not trying to diminish that. And the domino theories, I get all of that. I'm as aware of that as everybody else is. But Ukraine is not a NATO country, and we should not treat it the same as we would a signatory to the treaty. But yeah, to your point, that is a much higher level of rhetoric. If anything, I'm glad to see that the European nations took Donald Trump's chastisement to heart several years ago when he encouraged them to increase their defense spending, because this seemed to be the way the world was going with a Putin-led Russia anyway. So, look, I'm not too worried about a dramatic military escalation yet. But certainly, increases of inflammatory rhetoric often do presage such developments.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us. Mick Mulvaney, former Chief of Staff to President Donald Trump. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir.